Our third presenter is Caroline Webber. And Caroline is the Director of Public Programs at the National Archives of Australia. She's going to talk to us about, well, her talk is titled, Without Consent, the Challenges and Rewards of Creating an Archival-Based Exhibition when the Archival Record Isn't There, an examination of the National Archives Forced Adoptions History Project. Before we start, Caroline is, as I say, the Director of Public Programs at National Archives, and she's had more than 20 years' experience developing and delivering exhibitions in the cultural sector. She joined National Archives in this role in October 2018. In this role, she's delivered 2 quite innovative exhibitions prior to this one. I'm sure she may tell us about them if they come up. And she was the project lead for the Forced Adoptions Project. Caroline is going to talk particularly about the role that cultural institutions as public spheres and how they are uniquely placed to explore, interpret and present challenging and sometimes traumatic topics such as forced adoptions. And hopefully I'll get the slides to work properly.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the other speakers. It was really interesting. I'm glad to hear that your stories are happier. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land we are here gathering today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the people and countries on which our online colleagues are sitting. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that there may be people sitting with you today who've been impacted by forced adoptions or whose family members may have been impacted by forced adoptions. I'm sorry if being here today causes you pain. You will be listened to. And I'd also like to say thank you to all of the people we met during the project who shared their experiences so that the rest of us may know more of our collective history and responsibilities. As you know, the National Archives is responsible for securing, preserving and making accessible the records of the Australian government. We take it very seriously, as I'm sure you know that too. I've been with the National Archives about 18 years in the area which is responsible for making the National Archival collection accessible through displays, exhibits, publications, public programs and online. I often say I have one of the best jobs in the National Archives. The team I lead and the projects we deliver tell stories of Australia and Australians through the interpretation, presentation and promotion of one of the most extraordinary national cultural collections. You have a story, we can tell it. I'm not an archivist by training. My background is in museums, exhibition development and design, interpretation and engagement. However, over my time at the Archives, I have come to understand the power of the record, what it means to a person, to a family, to a researcher, to make that discovery that suddenly explains so much or leaves us with more questions. So maybe I've got a touch of the archivist in me now. Back in 2008, we curated the exhibition Shell-Shocked, Australia After Armistice, to mark the 90th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. Central to the exhibition narrative were the World War I repatriation files as a way of exploring the experiences of Australians who'd returned from war, what their life was like post-war, what the impact of the war was on their families. One of the stories was about Mr. Arthur Cox, a returned World War I serviceman who'd been severely wounded with gas on the front. He was repatriated back to Australia in February 1918 and required continuous medical attention for the rest of his life. But it wasn't until 1932 that it was accepted by the repatriation department that his illnesses were directly related to him being gassed in the war. As part of the exhibition development, we met his daughter Betty Carr, who you can see in the pink dress. She was able to add the personal story to the official stories we had in the repatriation file. He had 6 repatriation files, about 4 or 5 centimetres thick, each of them. It was when Betty read those files and saw those files that she turned to us, to myself and the curator, and said, "Now I understand why he was always so angry." It's an interesting thing that the record created 70 years ago, back then, were able to explain to a daughter the true depths of her father's illness. These records were created as an administrative tool rather than a document of ill health. The records are the evidence of decisions by the repatriation department. They're not evidence of Mr. Cox's illnesses, because if they were, surely he would have been declared TPI much, much earlier. It was also a really profound moment for me. It was the first time I truly understood the power of the record, how the information held within can change a person, can change an understanding of a past life. When I go back to that moment with Betty, I am reminded of the importance of records and ensuring access is given in all forms. This moment has influenced my approach to public engagement programs and projects I'm responsible for. People make the records live. The National Archival Collection is a collection of evidence of decisions made at certain times, usually by one or more federal public servants, such as those in the Repat Department of the 1920s. Certain their actions are true to government policy, but the results of these actions or inactions have everlasting impact. So to the Forced Adoptions Project, where we in the National Archives Public Engagement team were challenged to create something from nothing, in the sense that we don't have the records, and even question why the National Archives. So as part of the national apology to Australians affected by the past policies and practices of forced adoptions given by former Prime Minister the Honourable Julie Gillard on the 21st of March 2013, I was there that day, and Louise and David were there. The emotion was palpable. It was an incredible moment, and I feel very privileged to have been invited to attend it. It was announced that National Archives would deliver an education program based on the national curriculum, a website to identify and share forced adoption experiences, and an exhibition to increase awareness and understanding of the experiences of individuals affected by former forced adoption policies and practices. The National Archives project was established in June 2012, about 6 or 8 months before the apology, under a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Social Services. The records, though, where they did exist for people impacted by forced adoption, existed in state governments and private institutions. The administrative responsibility for births and adoptions sit with state governments, not with the Commonwealth. Yet somehow National Archives have become the keepers of a national archival collection that is evidence of these forced adoption policies and practices and the illegality of them. The term forced adoption is used to describe the action of removal of a baby from its mother at birth and the baby given for adoption without consent of the mother. It is the first point at which the records of evidence are created and the person whose records are about are silenced. We used the term without consent for the exhibition as it came through so strongly when we spoke with mothers. They gave their baby up because they had no power, not because they wanted to. Many of these women were under the age when they were legally able to sign documents, or they were coerced to sign. You can see the baby once you've signed the paper. Or they were made to sign while still under the influence of drugs. All illegal actions, but recorded in that record is the consent of the mother. Another piece of evidence on the record are the 3 letters BFA, Baby for Adoption. Through the physical action of stamping these 3 letters on the mother's hospital papers, the mother was silenced. She lost agency to control what happened to her and her child. BFA was often placed on the hospital maternity file as well before any discussion about adoption had been had or consent was given. The assumption by hospital staff was that as this woman was single, she either had no right to keep her baby or wouldn't want to. The subsequent actions of the doctors and nurses on the mothers were influenced by these letters, and these actions were not kind or warm. When women, and this is a story of a disempowerment of women by society and those with power, started to search for these records, they discovered the records were lost or destroyed, perhaps in some of those floods or fires, or so they were told. Persistence and determination did find some of those records. However, many mothers were surprised to find these letters on their hospital records about which they'd had no knowledge of. These 3 letters predetermined the outcome for them and their baby. For adoptees trying to find their parents, the challenge was and remains equally daunting. Adoption records are closed. They are opening now, but at the time that the Senate inquiry, they were still being closed. Adoptees were often told their parents did not want to be found or contacted, and it was only when they actually got the record opened that they realised their parents were contactable. Adoptees do have a document, like a birth certificate, but not, with their name and their adopted parents listed as parents. Or they could get a birth certificate with their mother and father listed on it. As you can see in this one, it says, but it's not official. The adoption certificate looks different to birth certificates, but you'd only know this if you'd seen a birth certificate. And of course, there are officials out there who do know the difference between an adoption certificate and a birth certificate. So again, a person with power can hold knowledge about someone without them knowing. We were told of experiences where other children knew a child was adopted because they'd heard teachers talking about them. Power to know something because the record is created for one reason, but not for the person themselves. It wasn't necessarily an easy journey to bring the project into National Archives. Why, as the National Archival Institution, without jurisdiction over the records and without the collection, should be responsible for delivering on these apology commitments? It was a Commonwealth apology. We're a national institution. We had some robust discussions, and they're always good, aren't they? But for me personally, and I think for the people involved, and I think also I'll speak for David Fricker, it was about the record or the lack of the record. Just because the record didn't exist in our collection or at all didn't matter. It was about telling a story and in creating a record and recognising an experience as a record. Just go back to that moment that Betty experienced with those repatriation files. For me, the Forced Adoption Project was and is all about the record, or in this case, the lack of a record sometimes, that accompanies, that acknowledges the personal experience. At the National Archives, we know how important records are and how powerful that information is. We willingly and actively provide access to records every day for people to discover their history. Immigration files, war service records, even ASIO files. And as National Archives curators, educators and exhibition managers, we enthusiastically use these records to connect Australians to their collective history. The difference this time is that we had to start with people and their personal experiences to create the record. We had to work with the people whose experiences were silenced, not the archive. We had to generate the archival resource so that we could respond to the apology commitments. The website we created, excitingly entitled Forced Adoptions History Project, was the opportunity to build an archival collection, photographs, research, personal experience, documents. It was all there. It is still all there. But to give voice, to unsilence the story, National Archives had to make a commitment to retain as National Archives the material provided to us in the process of creating the website, the exhibition program and curating the exhibition. Because the stakeholders needed their experience recognised as a record, it was really important to them, so we did it. It was through the stakeholder engagement and the creation of the website and its content that we were able to create the exhibition without consent. I don't know if every stakeholder we spoke to was happy with the exhibition and website. In fact, I'm pretty confident there were many who were dissatisfied with either or both. At this point, it's important to acknowledge and accept that whatever we did in this project, give voice, create an archive, accept an experience as valid, for many stakeholders, we could not do one thing that was really, really important, to go back to the beginning, to be that mother and child again. I also know that I've been changed by this project. My understanding of what an original record is different. I don't know if you can see that very well. One of the stakeholders we met, a daughter who'd been forcibly adopted, found her mother's hospital records. She was given a photocopy. It's not unusual. What is different is the value the daughter placed on that photocopy. For her, this photocopy of a record from the hospital is her original record. It is her evidence that this forced adoption experience happened to her mother, that her mother did not want to give her up. She lent us this original document for the exhibition. And I'd also like to just thank all the people who worked on the exhibition, the curators, designer, conservators, the touring team, to acknowledge that they treated this photocopy as an original archival document. The project also reminded me of the power of talking and listening. National Archives does not collect personal stories of Australians, ordinary ones like you and me. But having listened to the stakeholders, we recognise the need for their research, their experiences, their memories to be retained and kept in an official capacity. And it was it was because the National Archives were responsible of the Commonwealth responses that we were able to do this, because we were acting on a Commonwealth policy. Every correspondence with stakeholders, every experience captured on the website, every video portrait created for the exhibition, the apology mementos which you can see here, it's all now part of the National Archival collection. The records created are about people and for people. I think this was a constructive disruption of existing practice to enable us to respond positively to damage done by past actions. The Forced Adoptions History Project, the people, the records, the photograph, the research reminds me that these stories, told in the records that don't exist, or were created about people who became mute in the face of the administrative juggernaut, or were lost or destroyed or never properly created or managed, are just as important as the stories told by the objects held in museums, galleries and libraries. The stories held within archives give all of us an opportunity to examine who we are and where we came from. Archives, even when their evidence is not what we want it to be, are there to be tested, examined and re-examined. It is the evidence recorded and kept in an archival institution for the use of future generations to examine and reinterpret. It is the truth of hundreds of individual Australians' experiences at that point of telling. So here we are, 10 years on from the National Archives' commitment to the Forced Adoptions History Project, nearly 10 years on from the National Apology, which is the 21st of March next year, and we've just had the Tasmanian State Apology 10th anniversary. What did we achieve? We certainly raised awareness of forced adoptions. It did happen, and it has a continuing impact on people. It was wrong, it was illegal. We did create records of forced adoptions, now retained as National Archives. I also like to think that for the thousands of Australians who've been impacted by forced adoptions, their experience and now their records are no longer silent or invisible. Thank you.